Hello, my name is Ryan Toronto, and sitting in front of me is a list of 6 prompts, each of which correspond to one of the components of successful storytelling, which we've been going over in class. I will start by reading off each of these prompts and what they relate to. That way, everybody can see in the story that I'm about to tell that I have included each of them. Character. Dan the Normal Man was born to a family of mermaids, but somehow Dan got the human genes from each of his parents, leaving him half man, half man. Conflict is burdened by a curse that causes constant toe stubbings. Plot is competing in a triathlon. Setting, Antarctica. Theme, helping others in a time of need. Resolution, intergalactic aliens make contact. And without further ado, I present the story of Dan, the not-so-mermaid man who learns the value of helping others and intergalactic aliens. 20 years ago, on a cold winter's night, a family of mermaids anxiously awaited the birth of their first child. Upon his arrival into the dimly lit cave that was supposed to be his new home, it was immediately noticed that their adorable little boy had somehow acquired from his parents only the human side of their genes, leaving him woefully unprepared to deal with life under the waves as had been enjoyed by every member of his family up until that point. Though his parents loved him dearly, they had no choice but to take him to the docks and hope for a local human to adopt him into their family so he could be raised as a normal human boy. So, through their tears and their apprehension, this distraught couple swaddled their newborn in the finest kelp that they had to offer. They left him on the nearest dock, adorned with a tag that read, "Please take care of our totally human baby, as we cannot. Mommy and Daddy love you, Dan the Normal Human Man." The next day, Dan the Normal Man went with his new home, a disgruntled sailor who moonlighted as the town's witch when he wasn't on a ship, named Mordecai, the vaguely magical guy. As Dan, the Normal Man, grew up, his talents as an athlete became increasingly apparent. Dan could run faster than almost any of his classmates, and he took a bike with him almost wherever he went. This eventually led to his lifelong goal of competing in the world's most prestigious triathlon, which took place annually in Antarctica. The only problem, and Dan the Normal Man could not, for the life of him, figure out why, was that he was a terrible swimmer. He practiced and he practiced, but he could never master more than a simple dog paddle type of frantic flailing, which hardly kept him afloat. Despite this unfortunate obstacle, Dan, the Normal Human Man, reckoned that he could make up for any time he lost due to his amazing skills as a long-distance runner and bicycler. His dad, however, was becoming increasingly worried for his son's safety, and he urged Dan, the Normal Human Man, to compete in a marathon instead. But he was left exasperated by his inability to persuade Dan to alter his course. After years of watching his son nearly drown as Dan desperately threw himself into pool after pool, and just 12 hours before the big race, his father resolved to change his son's goals once and for all. Now, audience, this is probably the time it becomes important to inform you of one little aspect of Mordecai, the vaguely magical guy's, life. This aspect was that he was only partially adept at even the simplest form of sorcery, and it's said he was somehow worse at card tricks. So, as Mordecai, the vaguely magical guy, prepared his incantation that was simply meant to give his son newfound aspirations, it can be of no surprise that he forgot a component and completely flubbed the entire spell. Rather than a change of long-term goals, he gave his son a curse. This curse caused Dan, the Normal Man, to stub his toe once every hour for the rest of his life. What an embarrassment. What would the members of Mordecai, the vaguely magical guy's sorcerer's book club, do when they heard of this mistake? This rookie mistake. He couldn't bear to think of the consequences, so he decided that he would just keep his mouth shut and pray to the elder gods for their mercy. The big day was finally here. Dan, the normal man, woke up and he prepared for his race in the same manner that he prepared every day for training. He would jog and then he would stretch. And then after his jogging and his stretching, Dan, the normal human man, would devour his breakfast of fish scales and octopus eyes. And then he would head to the starting line. But something was wrong today. Dan, the normal man, felt clumsy, and he had stubbed his toe, the same toe, mind you, at least twice that he could remember in just the time he'd been getting ready for today's race. Despite this unfortunate start, he kept his head held high, and he began the first leg of the race. He neared the end of the running portion of the triathlon when suddenly Dan the man tripped, seemingly over nothing, and stubbed his toe worse than ever before, leaving him with, at best, a sprained big toe, which overwhelmed him with pain. Luckily, this did not prevent him from dominating the bicycle portion, and with quite a comfortable lead, he parked his bike and stared at the frozen ocean ahead of him. As he got in the water, it became apparent that his toe sprain, compounded by the fact that he was an abysmal swimmer in the best of conditions, was going to become a problem. Despite that voice in his head, he knew he had to continue. You see, Dan the normal man was no quitter, man. About 10 minutes into the flailing he called swimming, and with his competitors merely yards away from him, Dan realized that despite his effort, he was no longer even staying above the waves and chunks of ice. Dan flailed and he flailed, but Dan just sunk ever closer to the bottom. His vision became blurry, and he started to lose consciousness. As Dan, the normal human man, gave up any hope of returning to the surface, he could suddenly feel the rush of water on his face as he was quickly being brought up from the depths. As Dan, the normal man, reached the surface, he looked back in hopes of glimpsing his rescuer, but could only see a faint green light that seemed to pull him in its direction. It was about this time that Dan, the normal human man, and his fellow competitors noticed the large pentadecagon floating effortlessly through the sky as it dragged Dan to the finish line. Naturally, this prevented Dan from receiving a medal or the lifelong supply of free boba tea that comes mandatory and constitutionally protected with every triathlon completion after the year 1986. But this fact couldn't matter less to Dan. It couldn't matter less that he lost the competition or that he wouldn't have his promised boba tea. But Dan had learned a lesson. In fact, Dan had learned two lessons, valuable lessons. He learned that not only do intergalactic altruistic aliens exist, but that the value in life was not of winning a marathon or a triathlon or any race, but that it was found only when we seek to uplift and help others in their time of needs. But mostly the alien part. He would certainly remember the alien part.